So I don't know if I was introduced because I was actually sent some other way. I was roaming around Pristina before finding the location, so here I am. So I'm Charlotte Malterre. What I will be talking about now is the agency of informal architecture. As my predecessor was talking about sprawl, I think that this is one extreme form of sprawl, to the point where I would not call it sprawl anymore, but basically what is urbanization now. So my talk is based on my research work in the Egyptian context, and in particular in Cairo, where I've been conducting research since 2011 at ETH Zurich. And so maybe to explain the title, by the agency of informal architecture, I mean the power of it, and how architects can also play a role in a process that usually leaves them aside, or that they choose not to address. So this image, to start with, is of an area of Cairo, and all of it is informal, and I will explain why. So I just give you a few elements of context. The Arab Republic of Egypt is a 90 million country, south of the Mediterranean Sea, and most of the population is settled in the Nile Valley, that stripe, that gray stripe that you will see here, and in the Nile Delta on the northern part. And Cairo is at the kind of threshold moment. So at the beginning of the delta, and in its phases of growth, it has been expanding both on desert land and agrarian land. For those of you who have been, the pyramids are basically at the fringe of the green area on the southwest and southeast. Sorry. So you have the Islamic area, which is called Islamic Cairo, and then the 19th century city downtown. And also Heliopolis, which is a desert city built in the beginning of the 20th century, and Mohandesin to the left of the Nile is an area that has been urbanized in the 60s that we'll talk about, and of course new cities that have been built outside on the desert, such as New Cairo and 6th of October. So this is a conurbanation that counts 20 million inhabitants. However, there is no official number. The latest census reports 60 million, but obviously it doesn't take into account these areas. The latest numbers suggest that 60% of Cairo's population lives in this so-called informal area, which are covering a surface of about 160 square kilometers. So what you see are up to 15-story concrete and brick infill constructions that are not without a certain similarity to some of the sprawl that I have actually seen around Pristina here. These settlements are basically considered informal because they are built without any permits, and they are built on former agrarian land. This is a cadastral plan of the area that I just showed before, pre-1950. Maybe it's important to know that Egypt has a particular form of agrarian field that are called fedans, which are longitudinal fields of 200 by 17 about in average, and connected on each side to an irrigation canal and a road. This is due to, for instance, inheritance reasons, where you would split the fields to give to your children. So the same area in the 1970s, as you see on the, so there's the train tracks. The right side of the train tracks is the area of Mohandesin, which I mentioned earlier, a 1950s settlement, a formal settlement designed for engineers, actually, by engineers. And on the left side of the train tracks, you see on the lower part a sort of little settlements that's starting to appear. Now, this is the area today, so it's almost entirely urbanized. And as you see, the urbanization follows this fedan, so you have something that some scholars have referred to as the urban canyon. So This would be the process of growth, starting from the upper page sides. These fedans are already, as you see, these kind of like small subdivisions are called kirat, and are related to agrarian practices. You would lend a piece of your field to someone else, or you would plant it with another crop. So it's a subdivision that is already in the practice. So the owners would sell these small pieces of their land, and some construction appears. The canals that are linking to these plots are filled to create the roads. The buildings multiply and start to affect the agrarian practices. Also, land prices go up, and agriculture becomes less and less profitable because you start to have, so there's less water, there's also shade, and there is trash. And also, as the city advances, children steal the harvest. I mean, there is kind of like, let's say, damage to the fields. Then also what has to be said, tenants are evicted. This is thanks to a law that was passed in 1992 under Mubarak that lifted the protection that were existing prior to that. If some of you are familiar with the history of Egypt, there was a land reform, and Gamal Nasser handed over land to small farmers. This was revoked under Mubarak, and in 1997, rents of the land could go up to 26 times overnight, and of course people couldn't pay and they were evicted. And in the end, this is what you have. So the entire Fedan is constructed and the area is urbanized. And this is what I was mentioning when I talked about the urban canyon. You have a very longitudinal streetscape. There is a typical architecture that is generated by these processes. It's always the same. It's always blind on 3 facades because you would know that someone will come right, left, and behind you. The occupancy of the plot is complete except for 2.5 meters that you would leave for the street. Your neighbor would do the same in front, so that's how you get the street size. And then it's always a concrete structure and brick infill. As I said, something familiar to this area here. And then there is usually a central staircase with ventilation shafts. I want to show you a few architectural typologies. I will show you the smallest, the type 1, and the middle one, and the speculative one on the right side. So this is a small one. It's let's say the most common type. It also grew out of need. Cairo is a city that doesn't offer any kind of formal accommodation to anyone who is like not up to a certain income class. Also, people who don't have any papers or any bank accounts are not entitled to anything that you can find in the formal market. People don't rent because there is also a rent control system that's also based on Nasser, not for units that have been built after 1997, but let's say that the market is very unfriendly to lower income classes, which basically took matters into their own hands, and people would buy that plot and they would save a little bit of money and build basically 1 or 2 story until they have so savings, remittances, people sending money from abroad, also this collective pooling of resources that is called Gamaya within an extended family where people are pooling the money and using it once it reaches a substantial amount and on, or personal loans from person to person. Banks are not involved in this financing system, so it's a very incremental way of construction. When my son gets married, I can just build another story and so on. So it's quite efficient. The floor plans are pretty straightforward. You have a living room, 2 bedrooms, 1 kitchen and a toilet. As you see in the back, there is this shaft and there is a central staircase, or in this case it's a single staircase laterally located. There is also a balcony on the upper floor. So as I said, this construction is done step by step. This particular case, the owner had 4 sons, so he was taking the units on the ground floor with his wife, and for each floor he basically gave each floor to one of his sons, and then he also said that the top floor, which is not constructed yet, would be for his daughter, so he's also a modern man in that sense. The inside is unfinished at the moment of the survey, but as you see on the right side, he was keeping goats there in the upper floor, waiting for Eid celebration, so you also have an unglamorous form of urban farming. I mean, when people talk about urban farming, they imagine vertical greenhouses. This is actually what like urban farming actually looks like. So he uses the unfinished apartments for other reasons. This is another building, a little bit older and a little bit bigger. It's so you have two. It's an entire family with the cousins on the upper floor. The remote cousins get the upper floor because they are the hotter ones. So the floor plans are mirrored. You have two apartments per floor, and then it goes up. You have a bit of an ornamental treatment of the facade. This one is quite old, so after a while people might consider to use a covering for the open staircase. As you see, this is the last floor and the entrance to the right. They are having workshops on the bottom. Now this is type 5. Maybe why this one is interesting is because, as I mentioned before, this kind of architecture is very much incremental and it's also on demand. People decide they need a house and they put the money in it and they look for funding and they supervise construction themselves. So there is a very, let's say, organic relationship between the owners and the house. And this is a speculative scenario. So it's the moment where one could argue that forces of capital have discovered this form of urbanization, and you have a kind of a business partnership that created itself to construct this very big, so we're changing scale. It's a large building located on the main street. There's a partnership of 4 members. They bought the land, so we'll talk about these 4 kirats, 4 of these small field plots that I mentioned. At the time, it was about $200 per square meter, for those of you who are interested in prices. So it's about 400 square meters, and each floor has 4 units. From 60 square meters to 120 square meters. It's a little bit difficult to see, but they are basically, because it's such a big plot, it's actually it's not blind on 3 facades like the others, but has 3 facades to the right, north, and right of the building. Only the back is blind, basically. The upper shafts you see on the top are actually the blind side. So there is also a central staircase in the middle, where you see there is space for a lift, which was not installed at the time, and it's a 10-story building with double height ground floor, which will host a mall, 4 commercial floors, and then 4 residential floors. There was an engineer involved, no architects, but an engineer was involved to assess the structure, to check that it was the plans that were produced by no one really knows who. Actually, there are plans that are circulating, informal plans, and the construction process took about a year. And the ownership is divided by floor and then a half apartments. This is how the upper floor looks like, so it's not completed. As you see, it's very close to the neighboring buildings. And then for the price, a buyer. So the value of the apartment starts with about $20,000 US for a 90 square apartment, 3 bedrooms, a reception room, a balcony, up to double the amount for larger units. It might be important to mention that the investor, so the person who actually started the project, will have to move into one of the flats because he would have to prove in that way that the structure is sound to whoever will buy. So I think that's an interesting clause. I wonder if architects would do that. Are you sleeping? No? Because I make bad jokes about architects, I was expecting some reaction. But So what you have here is basically a speculative mode of construction with like developers or group of small investors that may build towers that can reach up to a total height of 15 floors. All of this in complete illegality, as I mentioned. And maybe what is important to mention, so this is quite a spectacular image, that also talks about something else, which is the competition between agrarian land and urbanization, which I think it might become a topic here as well. I mean, obviously it's a lost competition for agrarian land because in the case of Egypt, which is not a case, I would say that is not a local, strictly local case, agriculture has suffered decades of poor investments, and also neoliberal policies have basically destroyed the protective structures that were in place earlier. You also face, so this is also related to, of course, and fuels rural migrations and this lack of protection for tenants that I mentioned earlier. Also, there is little incentives for landowners to keep a land when it's adjacent to the growing city. Basically, you would be able to generate a 200% profit on a plot, so why would you not sell it? But of course, informal architecture also provides affordable housing, as I said, where the state has failed to do so, and in that sense is also an efficient response to the market. But the urbanism that is generated by this informal growth can be problematic. This is one of the urban canyon that I mentioned. As I said, you see, this is what the streets looks like when you give, everyone gives 2.5 to the streets. This is what you basically get. So it's a very narrow kind of urban form. Interestingly enough, it's actually quite, let's say it's a good climatic response because it's very hot in Egypt, so you have very well shaded streets. You have also quite a venturi effect. There is also quite a good ventilation in these streets, and also there is a very efficient social control. As I said, you would have a Fedan is connected on two sides, and whenever the police would enter one of the sides, people would inform the others and people could go from the other side. It's also a very efficient way of social control because why would you enter this street unless you are living in this area? There are no real commercial activities on this ground floor, as you see, so it has also some interesting aspects, but it lacks services, schools, water, electricity. Everything comes either afterwards or not at all. In this case, this area has electricity. As you see, there are some lamps, but basically people have to pay twice. I mean, the price of informality is that wherever other communities, for instance, I'm thinking about desert cities, would get infrastructure paid for by the state, these areas would have to convince the state at one point, so the municipality, to come and dig the street to install sewage system and water, and they would have to pay for it. So there is a kind of, let's say, punishment to this informality. And this leads me a little bit to this term that I chose when I talk about the agency of informal areas. In the case of Egypt, if you remember, in 2011 there was an uprising that basically got rid of President Hosni Mubarak after 30 years of authoritarian regime. And I think, and it's not just me, but many think that the political and economic grievance are actually closely linked to the situation that you can encounter in this area. There are also other factors like free market, and the impact of globalization has also been steering poverty, which is considered a factor of unrest. Now, what also happens is that we are in areas where the state is practically absent, and these areas have developed alternative modes of governance that function outside of the state realm. And interesting enough, this basically replaced agriculture, which was highly controlled in terms of taxation and ownership. As you saw with the cadastre plan, the state has and still has quite a good control over agricultural practice. and the rural world, but when it's replaced by informal architecture and urbanization, there is a major paradigmatic shift in terms of governance. The state is no more in power, and it's, as I said, absent from this area, and it only comes later to install water and electricity. This area, for instance, very interestingly enough, in 2011, so you had a vacuum of power, more houses were built as the state basically crumbled, so there was less control on what was built or not. And in this area, they are located very close to the ring road, which is a kind of a high-rise, or let's say a little bit elevated highway. They basically rented the caterpillars, and they made their own exits and enter to the highway because they could. And they did it, and then they put some asphalt, and they invited the governor to cut the ribbons, and it just went like that. So I'm talking about the agency of informal architecture here because there is obviously power shifts here at work. These areas also generate a gray economy that also manages to maintain a huge majority of people afloat economically and manage people to survive. And as I said, 60% of Cairo, so we're talking about more or less 12 million inhabitants live in this area. So I would say that all in all, it should come as not as a surprise that the demonstration that were challenging the regime in 2011 originated in this underserviced informal area. So I would argue that there's a link between this unjust urbanism of informality to self-governance and urban discontent. And to conclude, I would like to talk about so I would move from the agency of informal areas to the agency of architecture and how we as designer can intervene in these areas which are basically largely happening without us. So I would just give you a few examples of what we've been working on. So also how can design can be brought back in the game. There is also this attempt, or let's say this temptation by architects to always look at informal architecture with a romantic eye and romanticize also the situation. As I said, it's not that easy, but there is something that could be brought by design into this architecture. Now, this project, for instance, takes into account, as you see on the bottom left, it's the existing situation, so always up and down the existing situation. It takes into account, it calculates all the volumes that are currently used in the default typology by the staircase and the ventilation shaft, and propose a kind of circulation where you would have the staircase longitudinally arranged around the building. So considering that this is actually almost a copy-paste type of urbanization, if you manage to do that as well and you copy-paste to the neighbor, front, back, right, left, you can reach a much more porous urban fabric. I'm just showing you some of the floor plans, so you just have a circular staircase that's allowing for these kind of voids to happen in something that's usually very compact, and if you mirror them, you start to have a much more ventilation into the apartment as well, and into the streetscape, if you could be able to replicate that. Of course, when you confront this we confronted this. We proposed that. So sorry, I'm just showing you. This is how, if you would be able to repeat this system or to replace the current typology, you would have an urbanism that's much more proposing what is missing currently, which is public space. We proposed this to our local partners, and they were horrified because, and I let you think a little bit, why would that be a problem? Privacy, because a central staircase, of course, in a lot of Muslim countries, women are veiled, and they would not have to veil themselves if they're in a kind of familiar situation with cousins on the upper floor or on the lower floor. You would just be circulated into the staircase, and you don't have to cover up. This means you're basically on the street when you're outside. So this is also maybe something to consider. We also propose an alternative version where you could actually close the space with some textile, but that's not the same, in fact. This is another model that proposes, it's called Solidarity. It's basically arguing that you could get a better typology if you would build two kirats together, back to back, and have only one staircase and have a kind of central staircase that is more like a courtyard. This scheme also proposed, maybe you can see here, it also proposed on the upper floor plan there is a common kitchen between two apartments, assuming that in a kind of extended family model you would be able to do that. Of course, people were horrified again. Why would you want to share the kitchen? So it's also interesting how you propose model. This is done with students, and we confronted some of these examples that I think are actually very interesting, but show also the limits of what you can design and how what you can propose is at times problematic. I have more examples of this work into the book that I brought, that you should find at the bookcase in the cafe, I believe, and there are all the typological research in that book, as well as the proposed design, some of the proposed design, and now that's what I want to conclude with. We did in December an exhibition in the informal area, so we have a very small space where an artist has a small gallery, and we invested that gallery, proposing, it's called Ardella Homes, Designs by Young Architects, and it proposes 8 of these designs. As you see here, it's a very small space, but it's basically takeaway floor plans. So you would have, there are 2 of these, I just mentioned 2, so you would find those 2 examples, but a few more were also proposed. And the idea would be that since currently it's done based on floor plans that are circulated and replicated, then one could also try to influence these typologies by, so let's say, infiltrating design into this practice. This was actually quite successful, so we convinced one of our partners to build one unit. He chose one that I didn't show you, but I'm going to show you a version of how it looks like. So it's on this typical kirat structure with 12 by 14. We're trying to give, as you see, the bottom, so let's say the wall towards the street is a little bit recessed inside, so we're trying to give a little bit more to the public space. And we're also expanding the kind of shafts, current shafts that you have to something closer to a courtyard, at least on the ground floor. There's also a mezzanine on the first floor, so you can also have double heights and kind of more generous ground floor situation. And there's a separate staircase that basically give access to the upper floors. Sorry, the floor plan is a bit blind, but as you see the space, so there is a mirror, it's a mirrored floor plan. You have 2 apartments by floor and a common shaft for fluids, and then in the middle of this kind of like cross-shaped floor plan there is a living room which is benefiting from like the cross ventilation, but it's not directly exposed towards to the facade. And this is a floor plan that we developed together with our partners, so this is approved. It's not this kind of design where the actual users would be like, this doesn't work. So our partner validated that floor plan. He's actually very interested changing certain typologies. Now, the reason why he's interested in changing typologies is because there is also a bit of a market saturation, which proves that architects come at a very late moment in urbanization. What we also did, we added a back deer on the roof. For those of you who are familiar, it's a wind-catching device that allows to get the air into the staircase. In this case, we are basically having some small openings on the upper above the door, so you can have a kind of passive ventilation system. The facade is not very spectacular. We're actually still working on it because our secret agenda somehow is also to say that architecture can bring a kind of a difference, and also that it's identified as a designed informal. So there is definitely a kind of paradox in that term, but we are still working on the facade. So currently it's an ornamental brick pattern. We're also, of course, looking for funding because our partner agreed to work with us if there was some kind of capital input from our part. So we're like saying we can do the design pro bono, but we cannot invest. So we're now on the process of looking for funding. I leave you with this model picture, which is maybe another aspect of the work that we've been trying to do. In Egypt and in a lot of other places, informality is considered to be something negative. Egyptians, at least from middle and upper classes, have never been into an informal areas. They think it's dangerous and dirty. And we wanted to let's say contribute to that, to a change in perception of that. And these are so not only the designs that we propose, as you see with this design that I mentioned earlier, but also just showing that the informal, let's say that the urbanization generated by informality is also worth of being studied and of being exhibited as well. So this is a picture from the Bi-City Biennial of Urbanism and Architecture in Shenzhen. We also exhibited in the Egyptian pavilion in the Venice Biennale, not this one, the one before. And I think the Egyptian pavilion this year also has talks about informal markets, so there is maybe something happening here. So I leave you with that.